Iraqi Kurds. Now with the Syrian Kurds, they no longer see them as, opponents of Turkey, but try to have some sort of dialogue and rapprochement with them. They have also now turned their eyes to Geneva too, because the Americans are now dealing with the Russians and the Iranians to reach a diplomatic solution. The Turks have given up putting pressure on Americans to militarily intervene. So now they are putting pressure, they are pursuing Geneva II conference as recently as some days ago in London. Turkey, one of the 11 countries who is taking, who seems to be architecting the Geneva II. But of course, Ankara doesn't have any hopes that Geneva II is going to produce any results. Maybe. Finally, final word, Turkey has also corrected its policy by seizing on the new wave of democratization package. Some people underestimate this package, which was passed at the end of September, but even the European Union recognizes that this is a very major step forward. And I shall conclude by the sentence saying that this democratization package was prompted, I believe, by the Gezi protests, which are making substantial difference in the Turkish political scene. I'm sorry to have taken more time than I was allowed for, but this is as briefly as it is possible to tackle the questions I had to.
I remember during Gezi how Mr. Assad voiced his concern over instability in Turkey. So he didn't miss an opportunity to rub it. But you pointed out at least two dilemmas. One was that Turkey was, of course, helping the Syrian National Coalition, but at the same time involved with the radicals, undermining the FSA and the military leadership and the coalition. The other dilemma or tension was that Turkey was trying to contain the Syrian Kurds, the PYD, at the same time trying to engage them. But I'm sure we'll come back to those issues. Now, the Turkey criticism, of course, that Turkey tied its fortune to the Gulf monarchies. Happened to be in an easy partnership with them, and there's nobody better qualified to comment on those issues than my colleague Fatima Ayub, who is based in Jordan, but she's a policy fellow with ECFR. So, Fatima, if you could give us some perspective about the Gulf, including Iran, because in the definition of the Arab Gulf or the Persian Gulf, Iran is obviously part of it.
Thank you, Timo, and good evening to everyone. I will try and be mercifully brief, and also I would like to send the regrets of my colleague Daniel Levy, who is the director of our Middle East program, who couldn't be with us in Sofia. But I was asked to speak about sort of the implications of the involvement and policies of the Gulf and sort of the wider Gulf, in which I'm going to include Iran as part of this discussion. I can't say that I have any blazing brilliant solutions, but I feel like I'm in good company because it doesn't feel like anyone does. But I will just leave the conversation with some food for thought. I will also just say that I think in terms of understanding the Gulf and Syria, I don't think that there's anything especially complicated or secretive here. I think that there is a, even more so than Israel-Palestine, which in so many ways has defined the geopolitics of the Middle East for the last 60-odd years, I would argue that the bigger political fault line in the Middle East is the one between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And it's the one that's existed, obviously, since the Islamic Republic of Iran was established. Sorry about that. And that Syria, you know, for better or worse, falls very directly on that fault line. And we've seen that the relationship of the Gulf states, and this right now I'm talking specifically about the GCC, but most prominently Saudi Arabia is the most decisive actor within the GCC, or the most significant actor of the GCC. that there has been a sort of ongoing pas de deux with countries like Iraq and Syria over the past decade, as Iraq was pulled increasingly into Iran's orbit after the US invasion in 2003. You saw a sort of quiet, slow attempt at a rapprochement between the Gulf states and Damascus, investment, visiting back and forth. There were rumors, I don't know, for those of you who have been to Doha, you know, they have this kind of reclaimed land islands called the Pearl. One of these is rumored to was given from the emir to Bashar al-Assad as a gift. So there was a sort of an attempt to warm these relations as a means of sort of, I don't think certainly pulling Syria out of Iran's orbit, but certainly trying to build a bridge insofar as they had burned the one in Iraq. And Iraq and Syria being Iran's governmental allies in the Middle East, I think that the Gulf saw it in their interest to try and pull Syria a bit closer. This obviously fell apart in the wake of the 2011 uprising. But I think that, you know, what's instructive about how the conflict in Syria is playing out is that everyone's calculations, certainly when it comes, whether it's, I think, the Gulf or whether it's Turkey or even Iraq, Israel, I mean, Saudi and Qatar in particular, there's very much a very decided zero-sum calculation going on here. And I think that, you know, we've spoken about the fact that, you know, Geneva 2 is likely to, if it even takes place now at the end of November, is unlikely to produce an outcome. I don't think that Geneva 2 is not the process. Geneva 2 is the set piece. But I think that you are encountering as much resistance to a negotiated settlement in Riyadh as you are in Moscow and Damascus. And I think that this is a real problem. You know, I just want to kind of run down in a, you know, sort of a very quick top-line way in terms of what these actors want. And I'm going to stick to sort of Saudi, Qatar, and Iran, and we can touch on some of the others in the questions if people are interested. But I think that for Saudi, it's a Syria without Assad. It's preferably a Syria that's Islamist but not brotherhood. And we can talk about like a Salafi Syria rather than a brotherhood Syria. And Qatar's preference, obviously, since the onset of the Arab Spring, has been to cultivate new relationships and alliances with what it sees to be the ascendant powers of the brotherhood. And it's obviously gotten some sharp raps on the knuckle from Saudi Arabia, but also in the aftermath of what's happened in Egypt. I think that for many actors, the idea that you know, the brotherhood as a political force anywhere or ascendant is now under question. But I think just to talk briefly about Iran, and then I want to come back to some of these other issues. I think that Iran's calculations are slightly more complicated. You know, Iran does not have a sectarian preference for the Alawi regime. I mean, like the Shias of Iran are not, you know, they sort of see the Alawis as slightly, you know, a slight question mark in terms of their own, you know, religious affiliation. So this is not a sectarian alliance, but they certainly see, you know, the Assad regime as having been one that shares their strategic interests, their security concerns, and they see it as a friendly government that is equally hostile to the West. And this has been sort of been the underpinning of Iran's calculations in terms of its relationships with the Assad regime. But I think what's important, the question I think that's important to ask is, and I think there's more of a question mark in terms of Iran's calculus than with anyone else's. And the reason I say this is because when you speak to Iranian policymakers and analysts, there's a very clear recognition that Assad can't go on forever, and Iran will continue supporting Assad insofar as they see no viable alternative that will not present a threat to them. Insofar as the opposition all look to be proxies of the Gulf, there's no future that Iran can imagine that will that there won't be a future Syria that's hostile to Iran. So I think that this certainly animates Iran's concerns when it comes to Syria at a strategic level. I think that, you know, the zero-sum calculations that have so far shaped the conflict have basically, by and large, despite the refugee outflow, despite the kind of the tremors of instability that are now running through Lebanon, by and large, I think it was Joseph who was saying that people are so far paying what seems to be an acceptable price. The violence has not yet escalated to a level that is so completely abhorrent and unbearable that people are willing to stop fighting. And of course, it is the civilians of Syria who are paying the price for that. And also, we are fundamentally I think, at best at a stalemate, and at worst, I think, in a position where the Syrian regime has ascendancy. And I think the question that has to be asked is, where is the Gulf trying to align itself? I think I made the point before that a negotiated settlement is not acceptable to them. And I think that even a negotiated settlement, because in their minds, I think that the perception is that a negotiated settlement would doubtlessly entail the presence of Assad and the presence of the Alawi regime. They don't accept this. And I think that they will do everything in their power, if I'm being perfectly blunt, to derail any of the diplomatic process that's underway. Saudi Arabia, insofar as, Saudi Arabia for a long time, because of Qatar's support for the opposition coalition, which was very heavily dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood, they had kept their distance, but we have seen Saudi putting much more support, both financial and political, into different groups that are now fighting inside Syria. Their initial preference would have been to support the Free Syrian Army, which would have been more moderate and secular, but the FSA is essentially, and the Supreme Military Council is a hollow shell. There are many more powerful groups that are fighting in Syria, and we've even seen this very strange confluence now whereby Saudi money is flowing to more extreme groups in Syria who Saudi Arabia would never want to support in terms of the ideology of these groups and promoting a more globalized transnational Islamist project. Because I think that there is almost a sense of desperation in terms of trying to seek to tip the military balance of power, which obviously they were expecting the US to do when the conversation about a potential intervention kicked off. And Saudi is, as we can tell, extremely angry and annoyed and upset and is, throwing its toys out of the pram over the Security Council, its nomination to the Security Council, which it has rejected. And we've seen also a shift, a kind of, previously you had a very proactive Qatari, I don't even know if proactive is the right word, some aggressive and belligerent might be more accurate, policy on Syria. It has it has sought to pull back under the leadership of the new emir who came into place in May. And in all this, where are we now? I think that the one thing I think I'll end on this point, and then we can come back to some of this in the questions. I previously said that the biggest question mark here is about what Iran will do. And when, Hassan Rouhani and Barack Obama had a phone call, I think that simultaneously, like Bibi Netanyahu and, King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia and Bashar al-Assad probably wet their pants, like collectively, because I think that in the long term, the idea that there's a rapprochement between the US and Iran is fundamentally good for the region, because you do not then have this perpetual divide and breakdown between Iran and its wider neighborhood, from which it's been isolated for the last 3 decades. But I think that the question becomes, if Iran is serious about attempting a rapprochement, will part of that package be distancing itself from the Assad regime? I think that it's still a little bit of a it's probably a bit of a ways to go to get there, insofar as long as Iran interprets all of the opposition actors inside Syria acting with Gulf support, they are going to be very hesitant and resistant. And I think that the Gulf has been especially, I think, will become more aggressive in trying to undermine this rapprochement as well, whether it's in terms of its policies in Syria or elsewhere. So I think, as far as what does this mean is, whether or not the US and sort of consequently Europe can manage this rapprochement, if it ultimately will mean that you can redirect in the medium term Tehran's policies in a different way, that would be proactive. And I think it's also a case of reining in our present allies in the Gulf, because I think that ultimately the military strategy pursued in Syria is very, very destructive for the country. There's nothing, the proliferation of small arms in a conflict like Syria is a sort of foolproof recipe for state failure. And I really can't see it turning out any other way. So I think that it's a question of sort of pulling Iran a bit closer and trying to pull the Gulf a little bit further. But that's my That's my big picture on Iran.
Another person who's probably happy is Mr. Tayyip Erdogan.
Oh, yes.
But one thing we probably could explore along is the balance of power, because nowadays this Army of Islam is a new umbrella organization, but we may come back to it and how the Saudis look at it. But now the last in the lineup is Nadim Shehadi, who is a fellow with Chatham House and an old friend from Oxford, actually.
Yes, in Oxford, we had a Dayton Agreement in college. I don't think that the Middle East Center dealt with the European Center at all.
No, there was a church in between us.
There was a church, and it was parallel lives.
Yeah. But occasionally I sneaked in. I did come. But over to you, if you could share with us some thoughts about Lebanon, but also about more general the region.
Well, first of all, I want to really thank the Sofia Platform for inviting me again. The first conference I came to was a real eye-opener because it was perfectly timed at when we were probably over-enthusiastic and over optimistic about the Arab Spring. And we came here and we met people who had been through a lot of similar experiences who taught us a bit to be more realistic. I remember my conversations with Ivan Krastev and other people, but also had sympathy because they knew that the outcome will, they believed in the outcome. In the West, when you have people who are skeptical, they are against the outcome. So that was what was special. Can I borrow your pen? Oh, yes. I want to, I mean, I'm the last speaker, so I won't take very long. I just want to say that Syria is simple. It's not as complicated as we've been hearing in the media or in the conference today. In a way, probably Washington and Brussels and New York are much more complicated than what's happening in Syria. What's happening in Syria is a revolt against a regime which was very well described by Ambassador Valerie, the one dominated by security services, which suppressed all political life, and people are just fed up with it. I mean, there's no need to really over-explain this. It's not complicated that they want to get rid of the regime, but it tends to be forgotten because people complicate matters external, and they forget about the core issue. And I want to thank you for the pen. I want to explain to you my view of the Arab Spring. My view of the Arab Spring is that it is a spring. You see, this is a spring. And the spring, when you press on it, the more you press on it, the higher it will jump. And when it jumps, you have no idea where it's going to go. So if you have lots of springs and you press on them for most of the 20th century, and you lift that pressure, they will go everywhere. And one thing you should never try to attempt to do is to put as a precondition of knowing where the springs are going before you lift the pressure. Then you will never lift the pressure, and you're condemning people in the region to perpetual dictatorship. And that's what's happening in Syria. The hesitance of having a policy to help lift that pressure is driven by Western inability to see beyond Assad. They want to know where every spring is going to jump before they allow for the pressure, and that's why you have this paralysis and many of the complications we see in the view of Syria have nothing to do with Syria. I mean, now we're discussing Putin's relations with Obama. It's nothing to do with Syria, or Russia's new role in the world. Syria is just happens to be part of it, or the legacy of George Bush, or the legacy of Iraq, the traumas of Iraq. Maybe we need a lot of therapists to come to policymakers in the West to deal with the experience of Iraq. In fact, it was started yesterday. There was an excellent article by General Petraeus revising the experience. And I think that's what's needed, because we have learned very wrong lessons from Iraq. We've learned that if you have a dictator, then the dictator means stability, and if you take the dictator out, then the country falls apart. And that's precisely the wrong lesson. It's the dictator that destroys society to remain in power, as we've heard. And the sooner you take him out, the easier the transition will be. So condemning people to live under dictatorship for things like stability is also a wrong lesson from Iraq, which is being applied on Syria. And so other diversions like war on terror, Sunni versus Shia. When the Saudis and the Qataris and the Turks engaged Bashar al-Assad, nobody spoke of Sunni Shia. Now that they're against him, they say it's Sunni Shia. So it's a construct. It's not. It's an excuse. It's a mind game in a way.